Poor boy isn't allowed in class. By teacher, parents burst into tears, realizing why. It was finally the day that Tim had been looking forward to for so long. It was finally the day that he would go on a school trip to a huge theme park. Tim and his parents had been to so much this year, so a fun day at the theme park is very important for his memory as a child. The whole school was ready to get on the bus and get on their way. But when Tim wanted to get on the bus, a teacher told him he couldn't go. When his mom realized why, she burst into tears, not understanding what was wrong, not understanding why he could not come with them. Tim looked at his mother. "What's wrong, Mama?" he asked, confusion in his eyes as tears also threatened to fall down his cheeks. He had been looking forward to this day for weeks, but now it seemed like all that hope had been in vain. He didn't know how he could fix this. She kept saying, "I'm sorry." His mother wasn't a lot of help either. The poor woman only muttered to herself, trying to make sense of it all. Tim tried to hear and comprehend what she was saying, but all he heard was, "I'm sorry, I am so sorry," though Tim didn't know what she could be sorry for. Was it his mother's fault that he couldn't come to the theme park? Pleading with his teacher. Tim tried pleading with his teacher, but the man wouldn't budge. The parents of his fellow classmates overheard the commotion, and Tim started to hope the ground would swallow him whole, especially when Stephen walked over. Why wasn't Tim allowed on the bus? Did his parents have anything to do with it? And most importantly, who was Stephen? And what would he do? Tim never had an easy childhood. He was the family's oldest child, and with 5 younger siblings, that surely was no easy feat. Furthermore, his parents weren't rich by any means, making it harder for them to care for all of their children. It was what made this school trip special in the first place. It had been the moment for Tim to finally experience such a thing. Tim had been a good boy. He had been such a good boy because of it too. His parents had promised him that if he behaved, did well in school, and helped around the house, he could go with his classmates. Tim had done everything they had asked of him and more, yet the teacher still told him he couldn't go when he arrived at school the next morning. He had trouble falling asleep because of his excitement. He started to feel like a little kid again, which sometimes felt impossible with him caring for all of his younger siblings. Especially with the arrival of Rose, his youngest sister, everything had been extra hard, as her midnight cries would often wake up the entire house. Luckily this night, the baby girl had remained silent, and Tim was free to dream about all the amazing rides he and his friends would go on. He had seen videos about many of them, and though Tim didn't yet know if he was a thrill seeker, he was eager to find out. He had no idea that his dreams would come crashing down in the morning. Tim had planned everything meticulously before going to school. He had planned a specific outfit, saved some money for theme park snacks by helping his elderly next-door neighbor with some chores, and he had made himself nice snacks for the bus. He thought nothing could go wrong as his mother brought him to school. He couldn't have been more wrong. Mr. Foster said something shocking. He was one of the first ones to arrive, but he stood in line to board the bus. His teacher, Mr. Foster, was looking through the list of names of all the students who were coming with him, and when Tim stood before him, his brows furrowed as he looked at the list of names. Then, Mr. Foster said something that shocked Tim and his mother. Tim couldn't get on the bus. "Tim, you can't go on the bus. You are not on the list," Mr. Foster said, making Tim frown. How could he not be on the list? Shock washed over his mother's face, the cogs in her head turning as to what could be the reason. Then, the reason dawned on her as tears flowed freely down her cheeks. How would she be able to tell Tim? He didn't understand. Tim was just confused at the moment. Why couldn't he come with the rest of his classmates? He wanted to ask his mother, but she had started crying. He gently put a hand on her back, rubbing circles. "What's wrong, Mama?" He remembered taking the slip to his parents and for the school to know that they had permitted him to go. Had it maybe all been a misunderstanding? His mother was sorry. However, when his mother started muttering certain words, he knew something that wasn't the school's fault for what had happened. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," his mother kept repeating. Tim now blanched at the thought of what had actually transpired. Though he had been disappointed like this before, this time, it felt more like a betrayal. He couldn't believe it. Tears started to glisten in his eyes as well. He looked at the bus of his classmates, a few very good friends. They all looked at him with confusion in their eyes. Kevin, Tim's best friend, had gestured for Tim to sit next to him, but Tim knew he couldn't get on the bus. It had all been his parents' fault. He ran away. Before his classmates could laugh at him, he ran away. He didn't want to talk to his crying mother nor see the pity in Mr. Foster's eyes. He wanted to disappear for a moment, and that certainly wasn't the schoolyard. He didn't want anyone to say anything, and to be ahead of the curve, he simply dashed off. Tim ran into the school and pushed himself to the other students. Only his classmates were going to the theme park, which would make him the odd one out. He made his way to the bathroom, trying not to let the tears spill from his eyes. He didn't think he could ever forgive them for this. Tim was huddled in the corner of the bathroom, his head buried in his arms when the door creaked open. He heard the soft steps of someone entering but didn't look up. It was Kevin, his best friend, who had slipped away from the line for the bus. "Tim." Kevin's voice was gentle, filled with concern. He crouched down beside Tim, not saying anything more, just being there. Tim felt a small sense of relief wash over him, knowing Kevin was there, but the hurt was still raw, the disappointment like a heavy stone in his chest. Kevin didn't speak. He simply sat there, his presence a quiet support. At that moment, nothing needed to be said. The silence between them spoke volumes. It was an understanding that only true friends could share. Tim felt the weight of his sadness, but also the warmth of Kevin's friendship. It was a comfort, a balm to his aching heart. Slowly, Tim lifted his head, his eyes meeting Kevin's. There was no judgment there, only empathy. Opening up. Tim's voice was a mere whisper at first. "I did everything right, Kev," he began, his words trembling. "I helped at home, got good grades. Why did this happen?" His voice cracked with emotion. Kevin listened intently, his expression solemn. Tim's words poured out, a flood of disappointment and feelings of betrayal. "I just don't understand why they would promise me this, and then just let me down like this." A bond of understanding. Kevin put a hand on Tim's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I know it sucks, Tim," he said softly. "It's not fair." Kevin's words were simple, but they resonated deeply with Tim. It felt good to be understood, to have his feelings acknowledged. In that small school bathroom, a bond was strengthened, a friendship deepened by shared sorrow and understanding. After a while, Kevin stood up and offered his hand to Tim. "Come on, let's get out of here." Tim hesitated, but the look of encouragement in Kevin's eyes gave him strength. He took Kevin's hand and stood up, wiping away his tears. As they walked towards the door, Tim felt a bit lighter. He wasn't alone in this. He had a friend, and that made all the difference. Tim, with Kevin's reassuring presence beside him, stepped outside the school. His mother was there, her eyes red from crying. Tim's heart pounded as he approached her, his emotions a tangled mess. Kevin gave him an encouraging nod. Tim's mother looked up, her eyes widening with a mix of hope and fear. The moment had come for Tim to face the situation he had been dreading. Tears and apologies. As Tim stood in front of her, his mother's composure crumbled. "Tim, I'm so sorry," she sobbed, her voice breaking. She reached out to him, but Tim was frozen, unable to process the flood of emotions. "I wanted to tell you earlier, but I just couldn't find the words." Her tears flowed freely, each one a testament to her struggle and pain. A mother's guilt. Through her tears, Tim's mother spoke of her guilt. "I never wanted to let you down, Tim. We tried so hard to make it work," she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. Her words were filled with regret, echoing the pain of unfulfilled promises. Tim listened, the reality of his mother's guilt washing over him, adding layers to his already complex feelings. Tim stood there, a whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. He felt anger and confusion, but also a pang of sympathy for his mother's distress. The pain of not understanding why this happened battled with his empathy for his mother's evident sorrow. It was a lot for a young heart to bear, the hurt of betrayal mixed with the love for his mother. Seeking answers. Finally, Tim's frustration boiled over. "Why, Mom? Why did you promise me I could go if we couldn't afford it?" His voice was a mix of hurt and demand for clarity. His mother flinched at his words, the harsh truth of the situation hanging heavily between them. Tim needed answers, and he wasn't going to back down until he got them. Tim's father hurried towards them, his face etched with worry. He had received a frantic call from Tim's mother and had rushed over from his workplace. As he approached, his eyes quickly scanned the scene. His wife in tears, Tim looking hurt and confused, Kevin standing supportively beside him. The anxiety in his heart grew. He knew this was a moment that would require all his strength and understanding. The father took in the sight of his family in disarray. His wife was clearly distressed, struggling to communicate with Tim. Tim's eyes, usually so bright, were clouded with a mix of hurt and resentment. The air was thick with tension, a stark contrast to the usual warmth and laughter that filled their family. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the conversation that lay ahead. Seeking understanding. Tim's father approached cautiously, trying to piece together the situation. "Tim, can you tell me what happened?" he asked gently. Tim looked up, his eyes reflecting a turmoil of emotions. The father listened intently as Tim relayed the morning's events, his heart sinking with each word. He glanced at his wife, her tear-streaked face telling its own story of regret and pain. Tim's gaze turned to his father, seeking the answers he hadn't found in his mother's words. "Dad, why? Why did you guys let me believe I was going?" His voice trembled with a mix of hope and dread. The father's eyes filled with sorrow, knowing the weight of the truth he was about to share. He realized it was time to reveal the reality they had been struggling to hide. The father gathered his family close, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. "There's something we need to talk about as a family," he began, his eyes meeting each of theirs. He took a deep breath, preparing to unveil the struggles and sacrifices they had been facing. The truth was going to be hard for Tim to hear, but it was necessary for healing to begin. Tim's father took a deep, steadying breath. "We've been facing some tough financial times," he began, his voice heavy with a burden long carried in silence. "I made some mistakes with our money, and it's put us in a difficult spot." He looked down, unable to meet Tim's searching gaze. The admission hung in the air, a stark, painful truth that they had long tried to shield Tim from. Tim felt a surge of betrayal swell within him. His father's confession added another layer to his already bruised emotions. "You knew how much this meant to me," Tim said, his voice quivering with a mix of anger and disbelief. The revelation that his father's missteps were partly to blame for his shattered dreams made the pain even more acute. Frustration and sadness welled up in Tim as he thought about his role in the family. "I'm always the one who has to understand, to make do," he said, his voice tinged with resentment. "I never get anything new. It's always about what the younger ones need." The weight of being the oldest, always putting his needs last, felt heavier than ever at that moment. Tim's thoughts turned to the tangible reminders of his family's struggles. "I'm always wearing hand-me-downs from our cousins," He continued, a note of sadness in his voice. "I can't remember the last time I had something that was just mine, not passed down." The reality of his situation, often overlooked in the day-to-day, was now starkly evident in the light of the day's events. As his family absorbed his words, Tim's heart felt heavy. The reality of their financial situation, now laid bare, was a lot for him to process. He looked at his parents, seeing the strain and guilt in their faces. The weight of their struggles, now shared, brought a new understanding, but also a profound sense of sadness. He was caught between his own hurt and the empathy he felt for his family's plight. Mr. Foster, Tim's teacher, had been standing a short distance away, his concern growing as he overheard the conversation. He stepped forward, his expression one of empathy and understanding. "Tim, I'm sorry to hear about what's been going on," he began, his voice gentle. "It's clear you're going through a tough time." His presence, kind and caring, offered a small comfort during the family's turmoil. "I wish there was something more I could do to help right now," Mr. Foster continued, his eyes reflecting a deep sense of compassion. "As your teacher, I feel responsible for all my students, and I hate to see any of you upset like this." He looked earnestly at Tim, wanting to offer more than just words. His desire to help was evident, and it resonated with Tim and his family. Mr. Foster sighed, his face showing his regret. "Unfortunately, I can't change the situation for this trip," he said apologetically. "The arrangements are already set, and there's no way to add another student at this point." His hands were tied, and the regret in his voice was clear. Tim understood, but the finality of the words stung, closing the door on any lingering hope he had for joining his classmates. Hope for the next time. "But," Mr. Foster continued, a new determination in his voice, "let's start planning for the next trip. I want to make sure you can be part of it." His words sparked a small flicker of hope in Tim's heart. "We can work together on a plan, maybe even set up a fund for students who need financial help." His suggestion opened up a possibility, a future opportunity that Tim hadn't considered. "I promise you, Tim, we'll find a way to make it happen next time," Mr. Foster said firmly. "I'll talk to the school and see what we can arrange." His commitment was clear, and it offered a ray of hope in disappointment. Tim felt a mix of gratitude and sadness, comforted by the promise but still feeling the sting of the present moment. Mr. Foster's promise was a small beacon in the storm, a reminder that there were people who cared and wanted to help. Mr. Foster, with a thoughtful look, turned to Tim and his family. "I have an idea," he began. "What if we organize a series of fundraisers? We could set up events at school to raise money, not just for Tim, but for any student facing financial hurdles." His proposal was met with curious glances. The idea of bridging the gap through community effort seemed promising, a practical step towards inclusivity. Community support. "We can involve other parents and the school administration," Mr. Foster explained, his enthusiasm growing. "I'm sure many families would be willing to help once they understand the situation." He spoke of bake sales, car washes, and even a small community fair. The idea of garnering support from the larger school community offered a sense of unity, a way for everyone to contribute and make a difference. "The key is working together," Mr. Foster emphasized. "A collective effort can make a big impact." He talked about how fundraisers could foster a sense of solidarity and teach students valuable lessons in empathy and cooperation. His vision of a community coming together for a common cause inspired a new energy in the conversation. As Mr. Foster outlined his plan, Tim felt a glimmer of hope stir within him. The thought that his situation could improve, not just for him, but for others in similar circumstances, was uplifting. The idea of community fundraisers gave him something to look forward to, a goal that was tangible and achievable. It was a small light in the darkness, a possibility of change. The family and Mr. Foster engaged in a hopeful discussion about the future. "We'll start planning as soon as we can," Mr. Foster said with determination. Tim's parents, despite their current difficulties, shared a sense of optimism. They talked about how they could contribute and support the fundraising efforts. For the first time that day, the family felt a sense of purpose, looking forward to a future where challenges could be met with the support of their community. Tim found a quiet corner of the schoolyard, away from the bustling noise. Here, he let his thoughts wander over the day's events. He thought about his family's financial struggles, the disappointment of the morning, and Mr. Foster's promise. It was a lot to process. The reality of his family's situation, now out in the open, made him see things in a different light. As Tim reflected, a whirlwind of emotions swirled within him. Anger bubbled up as he thought about the missed trip and his parents' mistakes. Yet sadness crept in too, as he considered the love and efforts of his family despite their hardships. Empathy began to temper his anger, understanding that their struggles were not due to a lack of care, but rather difficult circumstances. Tim's thoughts turned to his parents. For the first time, he truly considered the burdens they carried. He thought about their daily struggles, the constant juggling of limited resources, and the sacrifices they made. This new understanding brought a sense of maturity. He began to see his parents not just as providers, but as individuals facing their own challenges. In his contemplation, Tim made a decision. He would go back and see his classmates off. It was a small gesture, but it felt important. He wanted to be there, to show that he bore no ill feelings towards them, and to maintain the friendships that meant so much to him. With a deep breath, he stood up, ready to face his peers again. The weight of reality. As Tim walked back towards the bus, his heart felt heavy, yet resolute. The reality of his situation was complex, filled with layers of emotion and understanding. He felt a strange mix of sadness and acceptance. It was a pivotal moment in his young life, one where the harshness of reality was tempered by the warmth of human connections and the promise of future possibilities. Tim stood at a distance, watching as the last of his classmates clambered onto the bus. The scene was bittersweet. Laughter and excited chatter filled the air. But for Tim, it was a poignant reminder of what he was missing. He watched as his friends found their seats, pressing their faces against the windows and waving to those still outside. It was a moment of farewell, one he had hoped to be part of. As the bus engine started, Tim's thoughts turned to the snacks he had painstakingly prepared for the trip. He had spent the previous evening assembling them, imagining the fun he and his friends would have sharing them. Now, the neatly packed snacks were a symbol of his unfulfilled excitement. Holding the bag in his hand, he felt a deep sense of sadness, mixed with the remnants of the excitement he had felt just the night before. In a moment of decision, Tim's heart softened. He knew he wouldn't need the snacks now, but his friends might enjoy them. Walking towards the bus, he called out to his friends, offering them the snacks. His gesture was met with surprise and smiles. As he handed over the bag, he felt a sense of relief, a small act of kindness in his own disappointment, appreciation and surprise. His friends gratefully accepted the snacks, their faces lighting up with appreciation. "Thanks, Tim. You're the best," they exclaimed, their words genuine and warm. For a moment, Tim felt a part of the excitement he had longed for. Their gratitude and genuine surprise at his gesture brought a small smile to his face. At that moment, the sense of community and friendship was palpable. As Tim turned to leave, feeling a bittersweet mix of happiness and sadness, he was approached by someone. It was Mr. Johnson, the father of another student who had been watching the exchange. "That was a very kind thing you did, Tim," he said, his voice tinged with respect. Tim looked up, surprised to be addressed. Mr. Johnson's presence was unexpected, but his kind words added a layer of comfort to the complex emotions Tim was experiencing. Stephen, Kevin's father, stood before Tim with a kind and understanding gaze. "Tim, I've seen how hard this day has been for you," he began. his voice filled with empathy. Life throws us curveballs sometimes, but how we catch them is what truly matters. His words, simple yet profound, resonated with Tim, who listened intently, feeling a sense of comfort from Stephen's compassionate presence. "I've always believed in the power of kindness," Stephen continued, his eyes reflecting sincerity. "Seeing you here today, giving away your snacks despite your own disappointment, shows a remarkable spirit." He paused, letting his words sink in. "It's important we support each other in tough times. It's what builds a strong community." Tim felt a warm glow at these words, a sense of being understood and valued. Stephen shifted slightly, his expression turning earnest. "I'd like to offer to pay for your trip to the theme park," he said gently. "It's not charity, Tim. It's a gesture of support, from one community member to another." Tim was taken aback, the offer both unexpected and overwhelming. The generosity of the gesture left him momentarily speechless, a mix of emotions flooding through him. Tim looked at Stephen, his heart full of gratitude, yet heavy with hesitation. "I don't know what to say," he stammered, touched by the generosity. Stephen's kindness was a beacon in his day of disappointment, a tangible act of community spirit. It was a reminder that even in difficult times, people are willing to extend a hand and make a difference, accepting assistance. Tim wrestled with the offer. Accepting help wasn't easy for him. He had always been taught to be self-reliant. But Stephen's offer came from a place of genuine kindness, not pity. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson," Tim finally said, his voice quivering slightly. "I'd be grateful to accept your help." It was a moment of humility and grace, an acceptance of the goodwill extended towards him. As Tim walked towards the bus, his mind was a whirl of thoughts. Accepting help was a blow to his pride, yet he knew it was an act of kindness he should embrace. "Am I doing the right thing?" he wondered silently. The struggle was real, balancing his desire to be independent with the understanding that sometimes it's okay to rely on the kindness of others. With a deep breath, Tim stepped onto the bus. His classmates greeted him with cheers and surprise, their faces lighting up at his unexpected presence. As he found a seat, the bus began to move, and Tim felt a surreal sense of joining a journey he thought he had missed. It was a moment of triumph over his circumstances, a step into an experience filled with potential joy and new memories. As the bus rolled away, Tim looked out the window, his heart a mix of emotions. Excitement, gratitude, and a lingering sense of unease danced within him. He was on his way to an adventure he had eagerly awaited. Yet the path to this moment had been anything but straightforward. The whirlwind of emotions was both exhilarating and daunting, a complex tapestry of feelings that mirrored the complexity of life itself. The trip for Tim became more than just a fun day out. It symbolized the kindness and support of his community. As he laughed and chatted with his friends, he realized the true value of connection and unity. The experience was a vivid reminder that no one is alone in their struggles, that a community's kindness can turn a situation of despair into one of hope and joy. Tim returned from the trip with a heart full of joy and a mind full of memories. The laughter, the thrill of the rides, and the shared experiences with his friends were treasures he would carry with him. The day was a testament to the power of community and kindness in overcoming life's challenges. Tim knew that despite the struggles, there was always room for joy and gratitude in life.